Hi, everybody. I'm Matthew Smith, the CEO of Fortify Rights, and we are very grateful to be here with you today.
Hi, and I'm Amy Smith, the Executive Director of Fortify Rights. Matthew and I are truly honored to be here today and to join this awesome network of people working to end human trafficking. When we first got the message from Fuzz and Carolyn asking to be the keynote address, we thought, they must have the wrong Smiths. I mean, there are a lot of us out there. But then when they told us that they wanted us to speak on the topic of navigating the complicated terrain of working with communities as an outsider, well, then we just figured they probably couldn't get anyone else. So we're on to you guys. But this is a topic that is central to our theory of change, and it's something we think a lot about. We're happy to share our experiences, but also to learn from others. Just by way of introduction, Matthew and I co-founded Fortify Rights in 2013. In short, we both found ourselves in Southeast Asia, then we found each other, and then we founded Fortify Rights in exactly that order. Well, Fortify Rights started as a mighty team of 2 in 2013. We've since become a massive team of 19 human rights defenders. Most of our team members are from the communities where we work. Most are women or minorities, and all of us are committed to ensuring rights for all. But why Fortify Rights? This is a question that we ask ourselves and find answers to every single day. We started Fortify Rights because of a need. In Myanmar, we saw and we continue to see men, women, and children being killed, arrested, and tortured because of their ethnicity, their religious beliefs, or their political opinions. In Bangladesh, we saw and we continue to see hundreds of thousands of Rohingya survivors of persecution and genocide being confined to overcrowded and ill-equipped camps or sent to remote islands without adequate support. In Thailand, we saw and we continue to see human rights defenders facing prolonged criminal sentences or imprisonment simply for standing up or speaking out on issues of concern. And we also saw and we continue to see how communities affected by human rights violations provide fertile ground for human trafficking as traffickers prey on the desperation of survivors and their hope for a better life. At the heart of all these horrors are communities that are often exceedingly knowledgeable and aware of the problems that they face. And they're also very much aware about what needs to happen in order to address the problem. So why do these problems still exist? Well, in some cases, affected communities might not have the technical resources to credibly document their story or the story of others in order to achieve their objective. In some cases, communities might not have access to the people who are able to change that situation. And in many cases, communities may fear severe reprisals for truth-telling or seeking out the truth. When communities lack technical capacity, access, or protection to address the problems that they face, there's a potential for violations to become normalized and the cycle of abuse to continue. We're working to end this cycle. So we do this by ensuring communities affected by violations have the tools that they need to document their truths, that they have access to opportunities to directly engage power holders on their situation, and most critically, that they have sufficient protection to exercise their rights and speak truth to power without fear of repercussion. We're not speaking for them or about them, but we're speaking with them. By working closely hand in hand with communities, we're not just addressing violations that happened in the past or present day, we're working to prevent violations in the future. And we know it's working because we have mountains of evidence to show that it is. As human rights workers, we're crazy about data. Collecting and analyzing information is all part of the job. And in addition to collecting human rights information, we're also collecting and recording data on our contributions as well as the impacts that we're making in the world. Since we started Fortify Rights, we've recorded more than 1,400 outputs. This includes long-form investigative reports exposing violations and recommending solutions, op-eds that have been published in some of the world's leading news outlets. We've had strategic meetings with high-level government officials and other decision makers, as well as conducting trainings and convenings with community-level partners. These outputs have contributed to changing more than 80 laws, policies, and practices. That means we've helped to bring 80 laws, policies, and practices in line with human rights standards. In real terms, these impacts translate into accountability for perpetrators of atrocities, the release of wrongfully detained human rights defenders, the reunification of families separated by arbitrary imprisonment, and restrictions being lifted and freedoms restored. So we can see that change is definitely possible. But in considering our data, what we see is that investigations alone, the process of collecting and documenting human rights violations, that's not going to achieve results on its own. Similarly, singularly engaging people with power on potential solutions aren't going to achieve impacts, nor will simply strengthening the work of human rights defenders or affected communities. What we see is that change requires all three. We need to investigate the problem to understand the problems and the solutions. We need to engage people with power on how to advance those solutions. And we need to strengthen communities affected by violations to ensure sustainable change takes place. But we can see that our theory of change is working not only in the table and charts that we have, but we can see it working in real life stories of survivors, of the survivors that we work with, as well as the communities that we're working in. And from here, I'll pass it over to Matthew to give some illustrations of our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'd like to share with you all a few illustrations of our work with Rohingya from Myanmar specifically. But before I do that, I'd just like to add a few additional points that speak to how we do what we do. As Amy mentioned, we spend our time in equal parts across the three components of our theory of change: investigate, engage, and strengthen. This means we spend considerable time investigating and documenting human rights violations. So we go to the places where violations happened or are happening, and we collect evidence. This can be eyewitness or survivor testimony, photos, video, or other material. While documenting human rights violations may seem fairly straightforward, it is one of our team's more complex activities. We take it seriously, and we take great care to not only do no harm, but also to actively ensure that we're doing good. And I'm sure we can all, conjure some examples of otherwise well-intentioned organizations or individuals inadvertently contributing to problems in this space. So I think when human rights work is done poorly, it can most certainly do harm. Apart from inducing personal trauma, some organizations might use or regard local survivors merely as sources of information in service to their own agendas. Others might use a tragic situation as an opportunity to make the story about themselves or their organization and all the good work that they're doing. Still others might regard survivors or victims as subjects in need of saving, thereby implicitly and usually inadvertently removing that survivor's input from the very equation that is meant to help them. So at Fortify Rights, our philosophy of human rights documentation hinges on ensuring witnesses or survivors or others are not merely sources of information, but rather full participants in the truth-telling process. This is a core value. It permeates all of the work that our team is doing throughout Southeast Asia. It affects the questions we ask, it affects the directions that we go, and ultimately it affects the final impacts of our work. We certainly do not have all the answers, but our team does practice this fundamental value of respect that is very simple, but sometimes lacking in our world. With regard to more substantive illustrations of our work, over the years, we've worked very closely with the Rohingya community, which is, of course, native indigenous to Myanmar, as well as other communities throughout Southeast Asia. With regard to the Rohingya specifically, we've worked to end and remedy human trafficking, to ensure justice for genocide and other mass atrocity crimes, and to end other crimes and indignities that they face daily and continue to face daily. For several years, as one example, we've hosted an annual Rohingya strategy meeting. These meetings, simple enough, they convene members of the Rohingya community to provide physical space for those in attendance to essentially set realistic, winnable objectives and to map out the strategies to achieve those objectives. Extraordinarily, the group has achieved numerous somewhat significant or even major objectives that were set at those annual meetings. For example, some years ago in 2016, the group decided that an independent international investigation would be important to further establish the facts of the atrocities that were happening in Myanmar, to get the attention of governments, to get governments to act. And so building on that decision and strategy, we fanned out to different locations, to key locations internationally with our Rohingya colleagues to press relevant governments to create this independent investigation. This work led the UN Human Rights Council to pass a resolution creating the UN fact-finding mission. That fact-finding mission in turn went on to document and further expose the Rohingya genocide. And that in turn, combined with our independent reporting as well as the independent reporting of a number of other excellent organizations, led the Gambia, of all countries, to file a genocide case at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, in The Hague. So the ripples in that case are evident. That case continues. Similarly, years ago with Rohingya colleagues, we had decided to focus attention on getting Myanmar army soldiers to The Hague, individual soldiers, toward criminal responsibility for mass atrocities. The hope was that they would face international justice at the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Many people told us we were crazy. Many people told us that members of the Tatmadaw would never end up in The Hague, would never face an independent, impartial court in The Hague. Our efforts in this area culminated with a months-long operation that resulted in 2 Myanmar Army soldiers being transferred to The Hague on September 9th last year. They're now the first ever perpetrators from Myanmar in the hands of the ICC. Human trafficking, which you all know very well, has also been a scourge among the Rohingya community. Fortify Rights is not, we're not an expressly anti-human trafficking organization, but we do work on ending trafficking when it is occurring in the communities where we're working. So some of you may be aware of what has traditionally been known as the sailing season for Rohingya people. This is the period during the hot season when Rohingya tend to flee Myanmar and Bangladesh in greater numbers due to the calmer seas. Over the years, we noticed that with every uptick of atrocities against Rohingya, more human trafficking followed. To this day, when Rohingya board ships from Bangladesh or Myanmar, they're typically deceived by operatives of transnational criminal syndicates into thinking they'll be comfortably taken directly to Malaysia, where they're told riches await them. Instead, these passengers become abductees, held in conditions of enslavement for the purposes of exploitation. They're crammed into boats, denied adequate food, water, and space. We've documented killings and rape and beatings and other abuses at sea on these ships. So for years, once in Thailand, traffickers typically herded their Rohingya captives like animals into horrific camps in remote jungle areas where their victims either could buy their freedom for a hefty price tag of $2,000 US or the equivalent, or they would be sold or potentially sold into another situation of exploitation, including things like debt bondage and other scenarios. So back in 2015, we had documented evidence of the existence of these death camps and mass graves of Rohingya on Thai and Malaysian territory. We documented hundreds of survivor testimonies. We rented boats and took to the seas in search of survivors. We visited Thai immigration detention centers with Rohingya human rights defenders, pressuring the authorities to free survivors of trafficking. And we traveled to the US to testify before Congress at a hearing related to the annual TIP report. So just prior to testifying in DC, we met senior Thai officials. At the time, we shared what we planned to testify about. We wanted them to know what we would say to Congress. We also shared with them what we would not say to Congress, what we omitted from our testimony. And in that particular case, that was the situation of mass graves. We were still collecting more information, but we also wanted to give the authorities an opportunity to do the right thing. At the time, the government denied the existence of the trafficking camps, denied the existence of the mass graves. Still, we wanted to give them an opportunity to do the right thing. So we told them what we knew and said we would eventually publish all of the information, including information about mass graves, if it weren't otherwise exposed and dealt with. 8 days later, the headline was that the Thai authorities had discovered mass graves of Rohingya trafficking victims. So combined with a lot of great work by a great number of organizations, this in turn led to what was the largest human trafficking trial in Southeast Asian history. It sparked an investigation, which led to prosecutions, which led to convictions. So that trial concluded in Thailand in 2017. The court ultimately convicted 62 traffickers, 9 of whom were government officials, which was extraordinary. And for a final illustration, also related to the Rohingya situation, in 2017 and 2018, you may recall the Myanmar army was attacking Rohingya civilians in Rakhine State, in a number of townships in Rakhine State, on an unprecedented scale. So at the time, we were meeting governments, we were meeting with diplomats, senior UN officials, other people who could help change the negative outcome to a more positive outcome. We were trying to prompt action. So we shared evidence that we had collected, evidence that genocide and crimes against humanity were unfolding. And in some of our meetings, we got the impression that certain people in positions of power believed that Rohingya themselves were somehow incapable of documenting credible, reliable, objective facts about their situation. We've since come to realize this is, of course, not a problem that is unique to Myanmar or the Rohingya, but it's a much more widespread issue. And unfortunately, many people do believe, for various ill-conceived reasons, that persecuted people cannot objectively represent themselves. We obviously disagree, and this particular scenario inspired a participatory action research project with Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. For those who aren't aware, participatory action research is more than NGO jargon. It means that the project was community-supported, community-driven, and action-oriented. In this particular case, the project lasted almost 2 years, and we published some of the findings in a publication, in a report called The Torture in My Mind. The project ended up focusing on Rohingya mental health. Interestingly, the team comprising 10 residents in the refugee camps in Bangladesh determined the scope and the content of a survey that they later administered. And the questions focused in large part on the situation of the mental health among the refugee community and survivors of atrocities. The photos in that report were taken by Saiful Omi. He's an award-winning Bangladeshi photographer and a good friend and colleague. Omi ensured that the photo shoot was consistent with the participatory methodology. The Rohingya photographed in the report decided for themselves how they'd like to be photographed. And in the captions in the report, they explain their decisions. They explain the rationale behind their decisions. Regarding the data in that report, we found that upwards of 90% of the refugee population in Bangladesh is experiencing depression, and more than 60% are experiencing symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. There are more than 1 million Rohingya living in Bangladesh in these camps. So these figures, when we compare them to other similar situations of mass atrocities in which there's available data, it's clear to us that these findings are off the charts. The research of that project also provided evidence that the Rohingya mental health crisis is largely rooted in the genocidal attacks, in pervasive human rights violations, and impunity. This was somewhat novel, given that surprisingly, there had been very little, if any, studies dedicated to the long-term mental health impacts of human rights violations generally. So while culturally appropriate psychosocial care is an urgent demand, we reasoned with the team from the camps in Bangladesh that a purely psychosocial response would be insufficient. To solve the crisis, governments must address the root causes. Perpetrators of mass atrocity crimes are still roaming free in Myanmar, as we can see with the horrific violations taking place as we speak. with in the aftermath of the military coup that occurred on February 1st. And those military leaders and perpetrators must be held accountable. So there's a lot more. There's a lot more to do, of course, and there's certainly a lot more to say about that project and some of the other work. But I think perhaps it's best coming from members of the research team themselves. And so please have a look at this short video to follow. And thank you so much. I look forward to discussing this and other issues with you. Thank you.
Funi ati lasam mata air ki horar o mare ara dilum toru buzurde ara dilum mate zetorilla sisokol budamadi jiram e sisokol tomara anno tu fayo hon tu in kengur fayo abarara in zana e kengur faro tomara to hen hoyer da seta nara besha bishi kisu mai menda se sokot fani ala gale hander ar kisu da sa tajumi ke ugi go o mare ara ke mate tomle haro to kol buzurgar gudi in ara kisu mai in de begin ara khalat ara khata kol ara duko kol ara doro to kol tomara to ere ni ala inno di kol ara kunai do de ara to ya tomara ri antu jatu gudi tomara no tomara da sara mai tajo goi ara to tomara da sara ro mummi ken dil hangori ba hon ladde ara da o sha Allah ara nijo hokka nijo lere porma jaga jundi tomara da sara hangin gorodde he durhi nara ya buzia shien hoiri tar da se bishi kushi kol zahir gujjar Ajuda se training no hoyer da se community zaire modod gujum boyen hoyer da se kan bishi kushi hasal hoyer da se gwa hon bishi dormore insan gunni indela kada bishi boot feel gojilam zenni ki ar jatire ai zaire buzai hoyare tar santire ai da su kesu bujuli fajum hoyare
I really interested to work with my Rohingya as being I am a Rohingya. Also, I came to know that how much the Myanmar government persecuted, torture, and genocide by the Myanmar government to us.
Even mother Sabigaris that on the Lia came Pura Kunsinji, but the insan or hawk of color Hoduniki Maji, Hoduniki Toziadi, Mavon and the Hoduniki Maniki, Gujiri Hindilla, Nigeran is a Dunokola, and Huede Tajilam, Sabi Baguriba, Furuskamani, Haidian. Gujida was on, Tosia Veda was on, Bulehana was on, Majida was on, Hindilla, Deka, Colbania, and Mother Shipishka.
Matt and Amy, thank you so much for giving your time and for doing this. And so we hope that people will have a chance to interact with you here. Perhaps we can start off with one question here is, I was just talking then about the interactions and the team, and you have an exceptional team that includes a mixture of people from around Southeast Asia and outside of the area. How did you come to build that team, and how did you start doing that process of actually working with people within country?
But in terms of in terms of how we began working, we started very small, but we back in 2013, but we had been working in Southeast Asia, particularly in Myanmar and in Thailand for many years before Fortify Rights began. And so we did have the, I guess the advantage of having really extensive networks that were built up over time when we decided to move forward with Fortify Rights. And that was very helpful. And just, for the most part, our team has been built around that, but also, fairly active relationship building in all the various areas that we're working. I don't know if you want to add a bit to that.
I think just the sustained presence in the countries where we're working. So as Matt was saying, building those relationships and building trust and learning from others within the countries where we're working. One of the things that our model is built on is this idea of shared leadership. So for our team, we're all leaders, we're all human rights defenders, we're all working towards one goal of trying to, ensure human rights for all. And finding people of those common values and learning from them and recognizing their leadership and everything that they're bringing to the table, while also like knowing that we all have brains in this and we're all contributing towards going to that same direction. So having a sustained presence in the countries where we're working, as well as recognizing everyone's contributions is super important. I think that's really what has given us this foundation that has built the organization from.
You need to turn your speakers off.
Okay. I'm sorry, we're having big tech problems. When it comes to doing the theory of change and working through activism, what have you found is the strength of activism, and what's some of the big challenges of activism?
Yeah, great question. I think, I think certainly one of the strengths of activism, I think, is the way in which it can keep people who are in positions of power on their toes. And I think, I think it's certainly helpful in that way. And it also, in some ways, fills a certain void that would exist when others might be pursuing other ways of achieving change. I think the weakness of it, one pitfall, I suppose, of activism is the way in which it can expose activists to security issues, security concerns. And that's really just because bad actors, as we all know very well, typically do not like truth-telling, and they also don't like communities becoming more powerful and exercising their rights. And so I think activism, in a way, really just puts that out there. But I think the key for us is recognizing that there are a lot of tools in the toolbox, and there are a lot of ways to approach problems. We go, the route that we go, but I think that acknowledging and understanding and communicating with those who might be using other tools in that toolbox can be tremendously impactful and helpful. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, great. Just some questions that have come in. A comment from Margaret, not really a question, but I'll give it anyhow. Love the theory of change. The change comes from informing the people themselves to find their own solutions to the various violations of rights in their own community. I love the respect aspect of your work that is so easily lost. We should never rescue, we simply assist with the change. Now we've lost all the sound again. Okay. All right. Can you hear it back now? Yes, good. All right. Love the theory of change. This is from Margaret. The change comes from informing the people themselves of their informing the people themselves to find their own solutions to the various violations of rights in their own community. I love the respect aspect of your work. It is so easily lost. We never rescue, we simply assist with the change. Thank you, great presentation. So that's from Margaret Stafford. Thank you, Margaret.
Well, let's follow on a question from that.
Yep.
And that is, how do you develop those relationships with people to be able to work with them?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I think it depends. It certainly varies community from community to community. In some cases, relationships build if we begin addressing an issue with the investigate side of our theory of change. Then we build relationships that way. Sometimes the first step, it would make more sense to begin some of the strengthening work, for example. But again, I think just over time, getting to know people within the communities where we're working, and not just for reasons of utility or reasons of directly related to the work. I mean, there are a number of people who we've gotten to know over the years, and our team members have gotten to know over the years, and then we'll find ourselves down the road working together on something where that was never the origin of the relationship, but then we've moved into this, something will happen or there'll be an emergency. And so I think there's a wide variety of ways. Also too, we have so many, 20 team members now, and many of them engage in these relationships in their own ways as well. Taking those fundamental values with them into the places where they're working is really the key, and they each have their own ways of doing it. Yeah, do you want to add something to that, Amy?
I guess just to add, and someone had asked a question about working with survivors in particular, and I know a lot of the people that are tuning in are also working very directly with survivors and people who have experienced particularly traumatic events, and sometimes are still experiencing those events. I think for us, one of the things of working with survivors is really providing an opportunity to share their stories. So like a lot of people that we meet with, they want to tell what has happened, what their experiences have been. And, when we're coming in, we're very direct about, we can't, we're not direct service providers. We're not, the United Nations. We can't promise anything, but what we can do is to try to help bring attention to what has happened, and try to get people to address the root causes so it never has to happen again. We're very clear that we can't particularly help in their case because we're not caseworkers. We very rarely have people say, no, we don't want, then forget about it. We're not interested in sharing our story. Most people want to share because they want to make sure that that never happens again. And I think making sure that, you're very clear what you're able to offer, as well as giving an opportunity for people to share what they want to share, as well as be part of the truth-telling process is super important. So being honest and being open and just being able to listen is key to all that.
Great. A question from Neith in Cambodia. So what are some of the strategies you use for ensuring the protection of vulnerable communities to claim their rights?
That's a great question. It was one I was going to actually go into that a little bit more in that last answer, because I think it's a crucial part of always thinking about protection, not only for the survivors and people that you're working with, but also for team members who are doing the work. And for the work that we're doing, we're often encountering situations where security comes up. Protection is always an issue. For us, it's something that we basically have woven throughout all of the work that we're doing. So it's not really a checklist, but rather it's something that we're constantly talking about, constantly assessing, and constantly developing different management strategies to make sure that both our team members, but also survivors are protected, depending on what the situation is, because every case, every situation is different, and it can change minute by minute, second by second. So it's so important to keep doing a regular assessment, a regular analysis of what the current situation is, and figuring out the bespoke way of how to address it. which, it can be challenging because it's not as easy as just saying, here's the playbook and this is what you need to do. It's really being able to, understand what the landscape is, what the situation calls for. And that's also why I think having those contacts within the community is so important as well, because they often know what the risks are, as well as how to address them.
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Another question that's a bit similar. I really appreciate your commitment to community participation and honouring the community's ability to contribute to addressing their needs and contributing a solution. How do you approach implementing this value, and what advice would you have for organisations that want to move towards a more inclusive participatory approach?
Sorry, we had
some technical difficulties here. Sorry.
So how to have an inclusive approach to this work. And I think we've been talking a little bit about that already. But one of the things is just bringing people who have knowledge on the situation within the context of where you're working is key to that. So having a participatory environment where people feel like they can have ownership over their work, and be able to be part of the decision-making process, and that includes team members as well as survivors and people that are involved in the truth-telling process. For us, we've kind of for our team, everyone has equal status within the organization, so everyone is contributing in their own areas, but they're also asking for advice and guidance from other people within the team. So just being open and having and recognizing like the assets that everyone is bringing into the environment is really important, including survivors.
Another question is, based on your experience in Southeast Asia, could you make a comment on the civic space and human rights activism over the last few years? Has it become easier? Has it become harder? What are the challenges?
Yeah, well, I think certainly as a team, we have faced tremendous challenges over the last several years in some of the areas where we've been working. So, for example, with the Rohingya in Myanmar, of course, the genocide has been an enormous. It doesn't even feel right to call it a challenge. It's so atrocious that it has commanded quite a lot of our attention. But in other areas as well, I think we have there are sparks of hope. There are we've definitely maintained an active amount of hope in these situations, and that's really part of that is because of the way in which we as a team try to internally at least make note of the moments when we have successes. And one thing we've recognized over the years is that the human rights movement at least has not, in our opinion at least, has not always been great at communicating success stories. And I think part of that is probably because as activists, we don't want people to shift their attention away from problems, right? So naturally, we stay a bit focused on that. But what we're trying to do as an organization moving forward is to really celebrate the victories. And there always are victories, and there are those moments of whether it's an impact in the traditional sense, or whether it's just something beautiful that happens throughout the course of a day, or with a community, or with colleagues or team members. So we do try to stay focused on that. But if I were to assess overall the human rights situation in Southeast Asia, I think is most definitely deteriorating over the last several years, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is a tragedy, and I think that would be echoed by many of us who are seeking to work there, and particularly with vulnerable groupings of people. A bit of a shift, and you might want to do this by using a bit of a case study, but Yoti has asked, tell us more about your theory of change, how you formulated and how you came to it. There's also another question about your theory of change, which says, how has your theory of change been impacted by COVID? And if COVID persists, what do you how do you anticipate you might have to change it?
Great questions. Yeah, so in terms of how we formulated the theory of change, I think it was really just over time working in the region, living and working in the region, and living and working in the region over the years, and initially for many years we were just doing investigations. Not for Fortify Rights, but in previous work, we were doing investigations or documentation, human rights documentation, and everywhere that we worked in the region, we recognized that there were members of the communities where we found ourselves who really wanted to be a part of the change, and they wanted support. In some cases, were explicitly asking for support, and so we saw a need for an international human rights monitor that was committed to strengthening the power of communities, and that was something that we thought was lacking, at least in the places where we were working. And so that got us thinking about, certainly what we call the strengthening side of our work and engagement. And we recognize too that, in terms of the investigative side, there needs to be more human rights monitors out there, in our view. And but human rights monitoring alone would be, in our opinion at least, would be insufficient to affect the kind of change that we wanted to see and that we believed was possible. And so it was really just a process, I would say, over the years of reflecting on the environments that we found ourselves in, trying to think critically about what was missing. It was really kind of a discursive process over the years of just, talking about the problems, thinking about where we had been and what we were doing and what we could achieve. And then in terms of COVID, I think that probably the biggest challenge that COVID has presented to our theory of change is, with regard to investigating human rights violations, typically, we get as close as we possibly can to where violations are taking place in order to bear witness, in order to collect evidence, to speak to survivors, in some cases perpetrators. And so obviously with travel restrictions and with the pandemic being the pandemic, it has made that part of the work a bit more challenging. And so we have done things like, we've done some work with our team on the way in which one could interview a survivor, for example, remotely. And there are standards that, general standards, I suppose, that some organizations follow, including ours, when it comes to that type of work. And so we've really tried to hone in on that. But amazingly, our team continues to be tremendously productive despite all of the challenges presented by COVID, and that's because they're great. But also, we really love our team. But also, I don't know if you want to.
I guess I would just say, and it kind of draws back on the previous question also about the shrinking civil society space on COVID, which we've seen, and I'm sure a lot of other people that are here today are also seeing, is that we see a lot of governments using COVID as basically a guise or an excuse to crack down on different rights and implement restrictions that are really arbitrary and unnecessary or discriminatory, actually. So particularly for people on the move, people that are at risk of being trafficked. We see that happening quite a bit, and it can put people at severe risk. So COVID has become kind of a catch-all for basically governments to be able to do whatever they want, and in using that as the excuse. And that's a really big problem, very dangerous, particularly within the human rights space. And we're seeing that quite a bit. And I think that just has given rise to like kind of giving a little bit more scrutiny to some of the restrictions that we're seeing being implemented.
Great. I'm just asking Joe what time we're meant to finish. But we do have a couple more questions. We'll try and do a couple more. Okay, another question is, did you want to?
Yeah, well, there's one here that's coming down in the chat, actually, which is how do you ensure the victims of human trafficking will not be re-victimized after Project Grant is finished?
That's a great question, and actually, it kind of stems back to the question also on activism strengths and weaknesses and challenges that I was thinking about in terms of for activism, and I think for some of the work that we're doing, and I think for trying to address these bigger problems. One of the strengths is actually getting to the root causes of actually trying to make changes, not only in one person's lives, but in all across the board. So trying to change laws and policies, practices. That's really what activism is about, is like trying to make these bigger changes and trying to change not just one person's lives, but many, many lives. And I think there's a big strength that activism has in doing that, but then also as a challenge is actually root causes, the same thing. It's trying to get at the root and trying to make changes that are broader. And sometimes what we see is we'll see a change in a law or a policy, but then there's no implementation, or we'll see, the implementation in one case, but then it's only in that one case, and we see it like not happening for the broader population. The answer, there's not like a great answer to that other than trying to follow up and making sure that there's sustainable change that's happening. You need to see changes not only in one case, but in all cases, and you need to see changes not only in laws and policies, but actually also implementation. So having that follow up, that it's not just looking at one aspect of what you're trying to achieve, but actually achieving it on a broader scale so that we don't see a repeat, because we don't want this to keep happening. It doesn't make sense if you're just saving one person, if you can like change the actual environment, the actual laws and policies. That's what really is going to make it a larger impact.
So Joe said we can go for another 15 minutes, but it's also reminded me that it's midnight where Matt and Amy are. So, but I think they've kind of reversed their day a little bit since COVID has come up. So, if you're happy to bear with us on a couple more questions, okay, that's great. Another question is, you've talked about how you figure out the risk assessment and keeping people safe in a very kind of almost intuitive but on the spot kind of way. Do you have a risk assessment framework? That's from Jenny in Sydney.
Internally, so with regard to our team, we don't have a specific risk assessment framework. Part of the reason for that, as Amy was kind of alluding to, is in some ways we found that the checklist, for lack of a better word, can give a false sense of security. And so if we had a very specific tool that we were using internally as a team, we worried, because we were encountering so many different complexities to the security environments that we're in, and very different from country to country, in some cases even different from state to state or village to village. And so I guess to give an example, so for example, if somebody from our team intends to travel to what would be considered a more complex environment, like a conflict zone, for example, where there's armed conflict taking place, there are a series of approvals that that person would need to get in order to carry out that work. There are a series of conversations that have to take place. And this is just one example, but there are also a number of measures that we have to pass through, so to speak, with regard to things like publications or events or any number of things. And so mainstreaming it really means that on any given day, most of the people on our team are thinking about how a particular situation impacts the security of the team themselves or the people that they're working with. And the key for us is really, we wanted to get it to a point where it was so ingrained in the thinking of at least the people within Fortify Rights that it was really just part of the daily work. And thankfully, knock on wood, we haven't had any major security problems. I mean, we're always dealing with security problems, but we certainly haven't had anything that that would lead us to go back and rethink that approach. But we are always interested in new ideas about how to maintain the security of ourselves and our partners. So we'd be very open to any feedback in that regard.
I would just say too, like we have protocols throughout the way that we work in terms of, and I think Matt was kind of sharing that, like just like in terms of there are approvals, there are like processes that people go through, and as part of that, security is always a conversation. So it's like that's how it's kind of mainstreamed in, is that all these conversations, there's if it's on a weekly just check-in call, if it's a monthly organizational call, security is always a topic of conversation, but then all the way down to like organizing a trip or a particular investigation or something, but the process itself is just completely embedded within all the work that we're doing. And I would just say that, yeah, I mean, as far as like security goes and protocols, is just really important to be always thinking about it. So yeah, that's kind of how we've worked through that process.
Just one last point on that actually is, I mean, one key principle that we like to think about and talk about is no surprises. So entering into a complex environment, I think one of the key one of the key things you'd want to arm yourself with, so to speak, it would be to have thought through any particular scenario that might come up. You really don't want to be surprised by anything. So even if the worst case scenario unfolds, it's not a surprise. But we find that to be helpful in terms of preparation and making sure that that our team is safe.
Great, thank you. So this is a question from Dai in Chap Dai, Cambodia. So I'll try and paraphrase a little bit. So thank you for the finding on the negative mental health impact on vulnerable people. Since the research was conducted by a local team who were already oppressed and violated, could it be that the finding wouldn't be accurate enough? Could it be that the negative impact could be greater?
Certainly, yeah. I think there's always the possibility that that the data doesn't fully reflect just how bad the mental harm is. Part of that project, I think, was that was helpful. The authorities in Bangladesh were actually preparing to they were demanding that humanitarian actors working in the refugee camps get rid of their psychosocial programming, which would have been the absolute worst thing that they could have done with a population of genocide survivors who were still reliving that trauma daily and experiencing fresh trauma in the camps. And so part of one of the many objectives of that project was to try to prevent that from happening. And as far as we know, it was helpful in that regard. But certainly, yeah, I think there is always the possibility that. And in some ways, for some people, certainly the lived reality is much worse than any sort of data set could ever really capture. I think there are weaknesses to relying on the numbers and the data, certainly. But in this case, we did find it helpful, and the team found it very helpful as well, which was really important to us, regardless of what happened outside externally. the fact that the research team did such great work and found it so rewarding was really important to the team. So, yeah.
Great. This kind of follows on again from Nathan Chabdai. I guess a question is, you spoke about the importance of data. How do you communicate that data to the communities that you work with? And how do you experience any changes as a result of your actions? So, for example, what was the impact on the Myanmar army going to the ICC?
Mm-hmm.
That was an incredible moment in the camps, and we had some team members there with some members of the community right at the moment when they found out that 2 Myanmar army soldiers who had confessed to atrocities against the Rohingya were now in the hands of the ICC. It was for some people, what they told us, it was one of the first times that they felt vindicated in a way. The other side of it was like, when Aung San Suu Kyi who's now of course detained, arbitrarily detained, but when she was defending the military in The Hague at the ICJ, just the very fact that she had to do that in a court of law was regarded by a number of people in the community as that in and of itself was a measure of justice, because it represented that ice block of impunity being chipped away at, that the authorities could not just deny these violations, from their comfortable places in Naypyidaw. They actually had to travel to the ICJ, and that case is of course still ongoing. Do you want to add to that?
I guess just to address the first part of that question about data, which is always my favorite, data. I love to dig into data. So, and often we're collecting a lot of different types of data. So in some cases, it's actually statistics, and it has like more survey-based data, and other times it's more qualitative data. So analyzing that is super important, because actually the process of research and collecting data is meaningless unless you actually use it. So you have to use that research and get it out there, and that's at the heart of what we do. So when we talk about investigate, engage, and strengthen, it's not just investigating for investigative sake. It's investigating in order to share and engage people on this information. So the data, once we have it, is basically to translate it into reports, newsletters, films. We use it for explainer videos so that people can understand it. And we really try to make it as accessible as possible. So of course our target audience might be a UN official, or it could be like a government official, but what's really important is that anyone can pick up a report or a news release and understand what we're talking about, and why whatever the issue is so important, and what the rights are to them. The beauty about human rights law is you do not need to be a lawyer to understand human rights law. If you think it's wrong, it probably is wrong, and it's that really is at the basis of it. It's the bare minimum of what we need to do as humans to respect each other. And if you understand that, then it's basically just trying to translate the information that we have to show this is a violation, and what people need to do in order to make a change.
Great. We're almost at the end. So one more question. I'm just going to pick up the end part of a question, and that is, what's your approach to transiting from a place? Have you had to do that?
What do you mean by transiting from? Sorry.
So moving your program out, or do you not see your programs as ending?
Well, I mean,
right.
It would be a beautiful thing. I mean, our mission is to ensure human rights for all. So the day that we're able to actually transition and close down, we achieved human rights for all in a country, that will be a wonderful day, and I hope it comes. We haven't done that, and I think one of the reasons for that is really because there are so many violations that are happening. Some of them are more severe than others, but actually any violation that happens is still a violation, and needs to be addressed. So for us, we want to see people who have the rights from freedom of expression to protection from atrocities to trafficking, making sure that there's protection from trafficking. So there's unfortunately a lot of violations out there, and we haven't gotten to a place where we've seen an end to it. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there have been few, since we founded the organization, there have been very few areas of work that we have transited from. I'm going to start using that terminology.
Yeah.
But the few cases, a couple cases I can think of where we did it, either an objective was achieved,
Yeah.
and there was sufficient comfort with moving past it, yeah, I mean, I guess that would be the examples I have in my mind would kind of relate to that. But as Amy said, a lot of the areas where we're working, a lot of the communities that we're working with are dealing with a huge number of problems, and so in some cases we will just carve out just one piece of it and work on that, and then maybe start working on another piece of it. And so in our minds, we're not really transiting out of it. We're still, working in those areas. But a lot of it for us has to do with our objectives, and part of it is like we agonize often about setting winnable objectives. And of course, with the human rights work, it can be, as everybody on this call I'm sure knows very well, it can be very difficult, to really figure out what is the winnable objective, and to really consider all of those variables. And so if we are achieving, or if we're setting winnable objectives and we're setting out to achieve those, we really wouldn't move on until we were satisfied that we had achieved something. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's.
Well, Matt and Amy, thank you so much for that. We have certainly come to our time, and thank you for staying up so late. But more than staying up so late, thank you for what you have done, investing yourselves and developing Fortify Rights to be able to do the work that you're doing, and for many of us to do the reports and give the updates that really help inform us to sharpen up what we're doing and what our strategies. We hope that that people on this and people watching this afterwards will have a chance to work through with their teams the things that Matt and Amy have been saying, and thank you for participating in this. And Matt and Amy, please can you pass on to the team deep thanks for the things and the ways that you do what you're doing, and for the continual learning that we know that you are going through, and that helps all of us as we share together as a part of trying to make this world free of slavery and free of human rights abuses. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being a part of this session.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.